Women aren't built for leadership? That's what my dad said, his voice sharp enough to slice through the clinking of silverware and the fake laughter circling the table. The words didn't just hang in the air. They crashed down, heavy, final, like he was stating some eternal law written in stone. Everyone else chuckled nervously, nodding along as if it were gospel. I sat across from him, my fingers tightening around the stem of my glass, heat rising in my chest while I forced my face into stillness. I didn't argue. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a fight. Because I already knew. My answer wouldn't come tonight. Not in shouted words. It would come later, louder than he ever imagined, in a way that would shake him, and everyone else, to their core. I remember staring down at the tablecloth that night, tracing the tiny embroidered flowers with my fingertip just to keep my hands from trembling. My father always liked to set the rules in his house, his voice filling every silence, his opinions leaving no room for question. He was the kind of man who thrived on control, who wore his authority like a tailored suit, never wrinkled, never doubted. Growing up, I learned early that his word was final, that daughters were meant to smile, agree, and stay in the shadows while the men discussed real matters. My mother obeyed that script flawlessly. She perfected the art of silent nods and careful steps, teaching me through her example that compliance was survival. But compliance always tasted bitter on my tongue, like swallowing ashes. Even as a child, I dreamed of something larger, of rooms where my voice mattered, of decisions that I made without needing a man's permission. The memory of that dinner still burns, the way he leaned back in his chair, smug and certain, a man utterly convinced that his worldview was unshakable. His friends laughed at his remark, raising their glasses, and I sat there frozen, feeling as though I had been placed under a glass dome for their inspection. What none of them realized was that my silence wasn't agreement. It was calculation. I knew words would be wasted that night. They'd call me dramatic, dismiss me as too emotional, and turn my resistance into a family anecdote of how I embarrassed myself again. No, if I was going to answer him, it had to be in a way that couldn't be ignored or belittled. What my father never understood was that leadership isn't something men are built for. It's something forged in fire, in resistance, in all the nights women spend swallowing indignities until the bitterness transforms into steel. And I had been collecting steel for years, piece by piece, wound by wound. That evening, while they laughed, I promised myself I would prove him wrong, not with arguments, but with undeniable proof. He thought women couldn't lead. He was about to watch me walk into a room and command it. He was about to see me bring someone into his world who would dismantle his certainty brick by brick. But here's the part he never saw coming. I didn't plan to confront him with anger or with tears. I planned to shock him with the one thing he never believed a woman could do: outthink him, outmaneuver him, and expose the cracks in his empire in front of everyone who ever bowed to him. That vow became my fuel. Every sleepless night, every whispered doubt, every dismissive smile thrown my way only sharpened it further. By the time the moment came to bring him, I wasn't the obedient daughter he thought he had raised. I was a storm waiting for the right door to blow open. My father's world revolved around hierarchy, tradition, and the kind of authority that demanded silence from everyone beneath him. And in our family, that meant my mother, my sisters, and me. And while my brothers were praised for even the smallest achievements, I learned that my victories were invisible unless they served his image. I was the one who organized family events, who edited his speeches, who stayed up late typing his business reports under the pretense of helping out. And yet, when the applause came, it was always for him or whichever son happened to stand nearest. I grew up being told that this was normal, that my place was to make others shine, that my worth came from being useful rather than being seen. And the older I got, the more suffocating that cage became. But I kept playing the role because I knew that openly rebelling before I was ready would only confirm his belief that women were reckless and unfit for leadership. So instead, I became a shadow that absorbed everything. His tactics, his strategies, the way he dealt with people, the way he manipulated situations to his favor. And I realized with a quiet kind of rage that if he ever thought I wasn't built for leadership, it was only because he had spent his life trying to make sure I never practiced it. Still, he underestimated me because while he was so focused on building my brothers into reflections of himself, I was building myself into something He didn't have the language to define. Something sharper, something he wouldn't see coming until it was already in motion. And that realization carried me through years of small humiliations. The dinners where I wasn't invited to speak, the family meetings where my suggestions were ignored until repeated by a man, the countless times he reminded me that my future was to marry well and support my husband, and every time he said it, I felt another piece of steel forming in my chest. Every slight became a brick in the foundation of a storm he didn't believe could exist in me, because in his mind women could only whisper or cry, never command, never dominate, never dismantle, and he didn't see that I had already chosen my battlefield, that I was waiting for the exact moment to turn all those years of silent observation into a weapon he wouldn't be able to disarm. And when that moment came, when I finally brought him into the room, I wasn't just proving a point to my father, I was rewriting the rules of our entire family. It started to unravel when my father insisted that my younger brother Daniel should take over part of the company, even though Daniel had never worked a real day in his life. He was reckless, spoiled, and constantly in debt. But my father loved the illusion of grooming a son to continue his legacy. So at dinner, he announced it proudly like it was already decided, like my mother and I were just spectators applauding. His wisdom? Daniel smirked, already picturing the office, the car, the title, and everyone clapped except me. I kept my face blank, but inside I was boiling because I knew how much of that company's paperwork, contracts, and negotiations had secretly passed through my hands. I'd been ghostwriting strategy plans, smoothing deals, fixing mistakes, and he was about to hand it all to a boy who couldn't balance his own checking account. That was the moment. I realized my father's belief in male leadership wasn't just insulting, it was dangerous. It was reckless. It threatened to sink everything he had built. And no matter how hard I clenched my jaw, I couldn't stop imagining the collapse that would follow. So I quietly began gathering, not just memories or feelings, but proof, receipts, emails, drafts of contracts with my edits all over them. I started copying files, saving messages, creating a trail that no one could deny, and the more I gathered, the clearer it became that my father had been using me as an invisible pillar all along. The company had my fingerprints everywhere, even if no one gave me credit, and that meant something. It meant leverage. It meant when the time came to expose him, I wouldn't be relying on speeches or tears. I would have evidence that could slice through his arrogance like a knife, and while he strutted around preparing Daniel for a throne he didn't earn, I was preparing for the day I would walk into that room, place the truth on the table, and bring him, the one person my father never thought I would align with, the one person who had the power to make him listen. My father's arrogance reached its peak during the company's annual gala, a night he loved because it allowed him to parade his sons in front of investors and remind everyone that the next generation of men would carry the torch, I remember. The chandeliers reflecting off his glass as he raised it in a toast, calling Daniel the future of leadership. And the audience clapped politely while Daniel barely hid the fact that he was already drunk. I stood there in a sleek dress I had bought myself, not to impress anyone, but to feel like steel wrapped in silk. And while my father ignored me as usual, I caught the eyes of board members who knew the truth. They had seen me in back rooms, had heard my voice correcting Daniel's blunders, had read my reports that magically appeared under my father's signature, but they stayed silent because in his world, loyalty was rewarded and dissent was punished. That night, I felt the burn of invisibility more than ever. I was the ghost who made things work while men stumbled in the spotlight. And yet I smiled because I knew I was almost ready. The files I had collected were organized, the evidence undeniable, the pattern of dependence on me so obvious that even his oldest allies couldn't ignore it. Still, I needed one final piece, one undeniable strike that would make my father's jaw tighten and his smug certainty crack, and that piece was him, the one ally he never thought I would dare to bring into his sacred circle, the person whose very presence would force the truth into the open. I had waited years for the right moment, and as I watched Daniel slur through his speech, as I saw investors exchange wary glances, I knew the time was close. I would not argue. With my father in his house, I would not raise my voice across a dinner table. I would walk him into a room filled with witnesses, place him beside me, and let the silence after reveal everything he had refused to see. The crack finally came when a major contract nearly collapsed. A multi-million-dollar deal my father had pinned his pride on. He had trusted Daniel to handle the preliminary work, and Daniel, as usual, had spent more time drinking than reading. The documents were full of errors, deadlines missed, clauses overlooked, and by the time my father realized the mess, it was almost too late. He was red-faced and furious, pacing his office, shouting about betrayal, incompetence, bad luck, blaming everyone but the golden boy he had handed responsibility to. And in that chaos, I stepped in quietly. I took the file, corrected the language, renegotiated terms with the other side, and within 48 hours, the deal was not only saved, but improved. I remember handing him the signed papers and watching the storm on his face settle into smug calm as he prepared to present the victory as his own. He didn't even thank me, he never did. And that was the moment I knew it wasn't enough to keep patching holes while he and Daniel steered the ship into icebergs. If I didn't act, all of us, every employee, every family member tied to this company, would go down with them. So I made the call, I set the meeting, and I invited him, the one man my father despised because he had once been his fiercest rival. The one man who had always acknowledged my intelligence even when my father dismissed it. I didn't tell anyone. Not my mother, not my sisters, not even the board members who whispered their doubts. And when the day came, I walked into that polished boardroom in a fitted blazer that made me feel like armor, my evidence organized in neat files, my ally waiting just outside. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a daughter or a shadow. I felt like a leader about to strike. And when I opened the door and brought him in, the look on my father's face was worth every silent humiliation I had endured. The boardroom fell silent when I entered with him, a silence so sharp it made the air feel heavy. My father was already at the head of the long mahogany table, Daniel beside him, smirking like he had just been crowned, and the directors lined the sides with cautious eyes. They expected me to slip in quietly, maybe pour coffee, maybe take notes, but not to stride in with him at my side, my father's oldest rival, the man he had spent years mocking, the man he had sworn would never set foot in this building again. Yet here he was, shaking my hand firmly, his presence commanding attention in a way that my father couldn't dismiss. The board members straightened in their seats, whispers rippled through the room, and for the first time in my life, all eyes weren't on my father, they were on me. I laid the files on the table, every document marked, every correction traced back to me, emails, drafts, signed agreements where my fingerprints were undeniable, proof that without me the company would have drowned years ago. And while Daniel shifted uncomfortably, my father's face went from confusion to rage to something I had never seen before. Fear, because he realized too late that I had brought more than evidence. I had brought validation. I had brought someone he couldn't discredit, a man who had once fought him in business, now standing calmly on my side, acknowledging me not as a daughter, not as a helper, but as an equal. The silence stretched until I broke it with a voice steady as steel. I told the room that leadership wasn't about gender. It was about results, and I had been delivering those results for years while being erased. I told them I was done being invisible, that this was the moment the truth stepped into the light, and as I spoke, I felt the weight of every dismissal, every belittlement, every night of silent work finally lift. My father tried to interrupt, tried to bark orders, but no one moved. The board didn't look at him, they looked at me, waiting, listening, and for the first time in his life, my father didn't own the room. I did. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. He called me ungrateful, accused me of betrayal, said I was humiliating him in front of his people. But even as his words echoed through the boardroom, no one came to his defense. The directors kept their eyes on the table. Daniel shifted further down in his chair, and the rival at my side simply folded his hands and let my father exhaust himself. When the shouting stopped, I slid the last folder across the polished wood. Inside was a compiled ledger of decisions credited to my father and Daniel that had been my work from beginning to end. My initials on drafts, my corrections in margins, timestamps proving I had been the one to turn disasters into triumphs. I let the pages speak louder than my anger ever could. And then I said it clearly so no one could mistake me. Leadership isn't inherited. It's earned, and I've already proven I can lead better than the men you keep propping up." The rival added a quiet confirmation. He told the board he had seen my work firsthand, that in another world he would have fought to recruit me years ago. The weight of his words landed heavily because these men respected him even when they hated him. And suddenly my father's bluster looked small, desperate, weak. He slammed his hand against the table, trying to regain control, but the directors were already nodding, already murmuring agreement, because they knew the truth had been sitting in front of them all along, and it took me dragging it into the light for them to finally acknowledge it. My father leaned back, pale beneath his anger, his certainty unraveling thread by thread, and I felt something shift deep inside me. Not just defiance, not just revenge, but freedom. The storm I had been carrying for years was no longer invisible. It had arrived, and the room belonged to me. When the vote came, it wasn't even close. The directors raised their hands one after another, their eyes darting between me and him, the rival who now openly endorsed my leadership. And for the first time my father's booming authority held no sway, Daniel looked like a child caught sneaking into a game he didn't understand. His face flushed, his jaw tight as he realized the office he thought was his inheritance was slipping away in front of everyone. My father tried one last desperate tactic, calling it a sham, insisting that a woman couldn't handle the pressure, that I would crumble under the weight. But his words sounded hollow even to him. They bounced against the walls without conviction, and when I met his gaze, I didn't raise my voice. I simply said, "I already have handled it. You just refuse to see." The silence that followed was heavier than any shouting could have been, because deep down everyone in that room knew it was true. They had relied on my competence without admitting it, hidden behind my father's name. And now the veil was gone. The rival placed a hand lightly on the table, steady, measured, and announced that he would be backing me in the transition. Not my father, not Daniel, me. And the board nodded in agreement. The motion was passed, the signatures began to form, and my father, a man who had spent his life mocking the very idea of female leadership, had to sit and watch as his empire recognized the daughter he had dismissed as unworthy. His face drained of color, his hands clenched but trembling. And in that moment, I didn't gloat. I didn't taunt. I simply straightened my shoulders and accepted the authority that had always been mine, knowing the most painful blow to him wasn't my victory. It was the fact that I had proven him wrong in front of the one audience he valued most. He didn't even stay until the end. Halfway through the signing, he shoved his chair back so violently it screeched against the floor, his face rigid as stone, his pride shattered in a way he couldn't disguise. He muttered something about betrayal and stormed out, Daniel scrambling behind him like a shadow trying to reattach itself. But the board didn't pause. The signatures kept flowing across the pages, documents that solidified my role, black ink sealing years of silent labor into visible power. Him sat calmly beside me, his presence alone enough to steady the room, and when the last pen was set down, I felt a stillness wash over me. Not triumph exactly, but the deep exhale of someone who had carried a weight for too long. The directors rose, shook my hand, addressed me with a new tone that had never been used in my direction before. Respect. And as the room cleared, I caught my reflection in the glass wall. I didn't see the obedient daughter anymore. I saw the leader I had always been beneath the surface, forged by dismissal, strengthened by silence, revealed at last in undeniable daylight. My phone buzzed with messages, some shocked, some supportive, and I knew the fallout at home would be volcanic. But for the first time, I didn't dread it, because there was no going back. My father had declared that women weren't built for leadership, and I had just proved, publicly and irrevocably, that I was built for far more than he ever dared to imagine. The aftermath was chaos. My father refused to come home for days, hiding in his private retreat as if distance could erase the humiliation. My mother called me in whispers, torn between fear of his anger and awe at what I had done. My sisters sent quiet messages of pride, the kind they never would have dared say aloud before. And Daniel went silent on social media after his friends mocked him for being dragged out of the boardroom like a child. But for me, the days that followed were a blur of meetings, strategy sessions, introductions with investors who now looked me in the eye instead of through me. Every handshake felt like a reclamation, Every email signed with my name instead of his felt like a new brick in the foundation of a world I was building myself. Yet, even in victory, the sting lingered, because my father's absence wasn't just silence, it was an open wound. He didn't call, didn't argue, didn't even try to bargain. He simply disappeared from the space he had once dominated, leaving behind a vacuum that reminded everyone that his reign was over. Still, there were attempts to guilt me, relatives calling to say I had embarrassed him, old family friends warning that I had gone too far. But I didn't flinch, because the truth was unshakable. I had carried the weight for years while being told I wasn't strong enough, and now the proof was undeniable. I walked through the offices with my head high, employees stopping me in hallways to say thank you, some quietly admitting they had known all along who was really keeping things afloat. And I realized leadership wasn't just about power, it was about visibility, about giving others permission to step into the light after years of being told to shrink. And though I knew my father might never forgive me, I also knew forgiveness was no longer the currency I needed. Respect was, recognition was, and I had finally claimed both in a way he couldn't undo. Bringing him had been the spark, but the fire had always been inside me, waiting, and now it burned too brightly to ever be smothered again. In the weeks that followed, I built something my father never could have imagined. Not just a role or a title, but a culture where voices that had been silenced for years finally had room to breathe. Women in the company who had once hidden their ideas behind the names of men began speaking up in meetings. Younger staff who had been afraid to challenge the status quo started bringing me proposals bold enough to scare the old guard. And slowly, the entire energy of the place shifted. It was no longer about preserving my father's fragile pride or inflating Daniel's empty ego. It was about results, about vision, about progress. And though I knew my father sat in his retreat stewing, replaying the boardroom scene over and over, I also knew he could never undo what had been set in motion. He had told me women weren't built for leadership, and in trying to prove it, he had created the very conditions that made me stronger, more resilient, sharper than any sun he had tried to elevate above me. The irony was bitter and beautiful all at once. And when I finally saw him again months later at a family gathering, he couldn't even meet my eyes. He looked smaller somehow, not in stature but in presence, as if admitting silently what he would never say aloud, that he had been wrong, that the daughter he dismissed was the leader who saved everything he built. I didn't rub it in. I didn't need to, because the truth was visible in every glance from relatives who now looked to me for direction, in every whispered comment about how different the company felt, in every signature on the contracts that bore my name instead of his. And as I stood there surrounded by the family that had once only seen me as background, I realized my revenge wasn't in destroying him, it was in living so boldly that his denial no longer mattered. I had brought him into that room to shock my father, but the real shock was that I had never needed anyone's permission to lead. I only needed the courage to step into the role that was always mine. And as I walked away that night, leaving my father in the shadow of his own silence, I knew the legacy had shifted forever, not because I had taken it from him, but because I had finally claimed it for myself. And no one, not him, not Daniel, not the old world he clung to, could ever take it back.